Thank you very much for your warm welcome. Thanks to everyone in this distinguished audience. You're all distinguished. But I have to say a special thanks to His Excellency, George Ramakan, High Commissioner for Jamaica to the UK, and his wonderful staff. I want to also express my appreciation to Reverend Carl Johnson. You know, he invited me a year ago, so that any other appointment for this week, any other invitation for this week, I had to turn down. I want to thank Reverend Wale Hudson-Roberts, Reverend Rosemary, who I now treat as my BFF, and of course Reverend Joel Edwards, and their team, because it's a large team. And I have to also thank Dr. Mark Richards. Very proud of you, my brother, for being here in this space, and your team. Everyone was helped to make this lecture possible. I thank you. Now, I have a very large family. I'm a member of a very large family. I hear Reverend Carl laughing at me already. But anyway, it's a large, nice, loving family. And some of the members of the UK branch of my family are here to support me. And thank you so much, guys. They're in the second row, the entire second row. I know that at least one person from the school I went to in St. Mary High School is here. Where are you? There he is. Thank you for being here. My colleagues, friends, and I know I have some former students from the University of the West Indies here also. And I'm deeply grateful for your presence. Indeed, everyone has treated me like a VVIP. And speaking of VVIP, I was so deflated, though, to learn from the immigration officer at Gatwick that the VVIP stamped in my passport for the past several trips to the UK did not mean very, very important person, but visitor's visa and previous passport. That aside, this is Heritage Month in Jamaica, when we honor national heroes and the one heroine. And it's a month in which we recall the Morant Bay War of 1865, in which, at the order of the Bedfordshire-born Governor John Eyre, over 400 black people were murdered. And it is Black History Month here in the UK. I will not enter the debate about whether or not Black History Month or Heritage Month are necessary. They exist now. And so, in the spirit of Black History and Heritage Month, I start by paying tribute to all our ancestors in Africa who created great civilizations that empowered us to know that our history did not start with slavery. The men and women on both sides of the Atlantic, enslaved and free, who fought against capture and enslavement, who employed diverse strategies to agitate for the ending of what was arguably the greatest crime against humanity, who in the post-slavery and post-independence periods continued the fight for justice, the black men and women whose blood, sweat, and tears built this country of the UK, so that when we see the so-called great houses and castles, to which I hope you realize you should have free access for life, shouldn't pay to go into them, the banks and insurance companies, the churches and universities on this landscape, we can say our ancestors made them possible. Men and women who in the post-colonial period, like the Windrush generation and their descendants, continued the struggle for rights and respect. May we never dishonor them by giving up the fight against injustice grounded in racial discrimination. I pay respects to my own enslaved ancestor, Alexander Mighty, my great-great-grandfather, who was born into slavery in Jamaica in 1829, but who was left at 5 years old at the time of emancipation in 1834, with nothing but freedom, unlike the planter class who received compensation. I speak this evening on behalf of all the ancestors who lost their lives in the anti-colonial liberation movements in the Caribbean and here, because they had to finish what the Tainos, the Maroons, Chief Tachi from Ghana, Sam Sharpe and others had started. Let us invite their spirits to occupy the spaces around us this evening as we seek for the appeasement of their torture and the redemption of their souls. I hope that at the end of this evening's deliberations, we will all agree that the denial of reparation for the wrongs of the past is abhorrent to the spirit of justice, and intensify our resolve to demand reparation from those who wronged our ancestors, but who have to date refused to take responsibility for that wrong or engage in a reparatory justice conversation. Among those who bore the brunt of British terrorism in the Caribbean were enslaved women who had no choice but to resist the repression of African enslavement, and many of whom must be regarded as soldiers in Sam Sharpe's army and abolitionists in the cause of emancipation. I know that we are more accustomed to viewing as abolitionists the men on the screen, like Mansfield, Fox, Wilberforce, Clarkson, Knibb, and Newton, as well as women, Queen Victoria Ann Knight, who was a Quaker from Essex, Mary Burkett Card, Georgina the Duchess of Devonshire, and Elizabeth Hayrick. But thanks to those like Lucille Mathurin Mayer, who since the emergence of the definable field of women's history have used their scholarship in the service of knowledge production, so that we now know what others never wanted us to know, we can say confidently that we extend the term abolitionist to the women and men that we see here. Alida, Nanny of the Maroons, I think you recognize. One Tete, a Maroon woman from St. Martin. One Tete because when she was caught, they cut off her breast. I guess in Jamaica we say titi, but in St. Martin they say tete. And of course, we have Sally Bassett in the middle. And in case you think I don't know anything, there's me there at the base. In Bermuda and Solitude. And of course the men. So these are some of our abolitionists. When we think about abolitionists, think of Bussa, think of Equiano, think of Kofi in Guyana, think of Toussaint, Ignatius Sancho, and Sam Sharpe. The revisionist historians have brought the history of the black abolitionist women in Sharpe's army to our attention. Their formidable analyses represent powerful counter-discourses to the type of knowledge production that marginalize women's fundamental role in capital accumulation and the destabilization of the slave system. And they bring truth to the African proverb, until the lion tells his own story, the tale of the hunt will glorify the hunter. That also applies to the lionesses, I assure you, women in this audience. So who were some of these women who supported Samuel Sharpe, the acknowledged leader of the 1831-32 Emancipation War in Jamaica, which started in St. James, but practically engulfed the entire island? And if your parish was not involved, well, you have to go figure out why. Now, those of you who are from Jamaica. So, a man born in 1801 and hanged for his activism on May 23rd, 1832, a day when we mark Labor Day. How appropriate. Age 31, a native Baptist preacher whose anti-slavery commitment made him take up arms, a fouling peace, reportedly, and made his lieutenants swear to an oath on the Christian Bible to fight for freedom when peaceful protest seemed unworkable. And by the way, when I was reading the documents in the National Archives here, and saw that Sam Sharpe, from one of the witnesses, had a fouling piece, I embarrassed myself by saying on national radio, wait, Sam Sharpe kept a hen coop or kept chickens? Until someone called in to say, Prof, it means it's a shotgun or a scattergun. So, with suitable reverence, I want to call the names of some of these women who were in Sam Sharpe's army, because I don't know how many of you have ever seen these names. Catherine Brown, enslaved by Mrs. Griffith on Cascade Pen in Hanover. Catherine Clark from Hanover. Anne James, Christina James, Eliza James, Susan James, Anne Ramsey, Mary Campbell, Nancy Campbell, and Sarah Darling, and many others, which you'll see here. It was the very existence of slavery that caused these women to engage in acts of resistance. Once located in the Americas, they were enslaved in large numbers and subjected to various forms of exploitation and control, not least those of being categorized as property and unfree laborers and forced to work without wages, mainly in fields, factories, and planters' houses. Enslavers appropriated their reproductive lives by claiming their children as property and used skin color as justification for making women reproduce the status of enslavement, unlike white women who could only reproduce this free status, even if black men fathered their children. They were subjected to rape, sexploitation. For neither colonial statutes nor codes, which formed a part of the superstructure of slavery designed to control those enslaved, invested enslaved women with any rights over their bodies, but rather transferred and consolidated such rights within the legal person of the enslavers. Laws also sought to defeminize women, to tell them what fabric they could wear and what fabric was too good for them. Which is why we dress up so you know, because we say, you can't tell us anymore what to wear. So laws also sought to defeminize women, and race became a crucial factor in the social stratification of the slave societies and heightened the struggle for rights, respect, and equality in the entire Caribbean. But every form of control generates an opposing struggle for liberation. As Harriet Jacobs said, and I quote, "My master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will. There is might in each." Gendered patterns of resistance emerged to attempts to enforce white supremacy through racialized slavery. Modern scholarship affirms that black women were a fundamental part of the campaign for freedom and rights in the colonial Caribbean, and that anti-slavery activism was not the preserve of males, as was argued by the older scholarship. Many 18th and 19th century accounts testify to enslaved women's rebelliousness and resistance to rape and to the plantation work regime. And in this resistance to rape, they were following on their Taino, indigenous peoples' example, because the Kalinago people of the Eastern Caribbean used their fingernails as weapons against rape. They scratched them up, you see? Bernard Senior, a British military officer active in the repression of the 1831-32 anti-slavery war in Jamaica led by Sam Sharpe, in describing instances of malingering, insolence, and the attempt to enforce moral economy on several plantations, admitted that women as well as men were alike defaulters. They participated in armed revolt, marronage, and in the day-to-day acts of resistance that destabilized the regime on which slavery rested. It was Frederick Douglass of the United States, who was a former enslaved person, who lived to write and read, David. And he said, When the true history of the anti-slavery cause shall be written, women will occupy a large space in its pages, for the cause of the slave has been peculiarly woman's cause. End of quote. Now, the storyboard at Kensington in the parish of St. James, where the 1831-32 Emancipation War started, states boldly that an enslaved woman is credited with lighting the first fire as a signal. And if you are from Jamaica and you know where Kensington is, you know the mountainous backbone of the country, you can understand. Kensington was number one. And then Leogan and other plantations, and so on and so on. And the storyboard says, apparently she said, somebody captured these words, "I know I shall die for it, but my children shall be free." And Minister Grange, because we don't know her name, Minister Grange for now, until we find out, has christened her Fire. Bernard Sr. tells us that a party of soldiers tracking down rebels who had taken 15 white women captive captured a young black woman who had abandoned her task of filling 5 gourds with water when she heard them approaching. According to Senior, the enslaved woman pleaded great penitence, acknowledging that she had long ago left her owner's service without leave or cause, but having been so long, denied any knowledge of the war. She did admit that she had heard that as soon as the Baptist parson returned from England, all the enslaved would be free. But she left the plantation because she thought, well, there would be no harm in taking her freedom a little bit before the time appointed. Asked why one person needed so much water, she said that she was living in the woods by herself, and that on the day in question, she was washing all her clothes and wished to carry plenty of water at once for the purpose. One of the soldiers decided that she was lying and commanded her to lead them to where the rebels were keeping the captives. She proceeded to do just that, or so they thought. She was in fact leading them away from the camp. But unfortunately for her, this was soon discovered, for one of the soldiers noticed that she carefully avoided every heavily traveled path and invariably took those newly cut and little used ones. After going about 100 yards or so, past a path with the entrance blocked with newly cut logwood branches, which the woman had passed without so much as a glance in that direction, one of the soldiers insisted that he had heard voices a little distance in the woods. According to Senior, she affirmed that it was quite impossible, as she knew every track in the neighborhood, and the logwood had been cut by herself and placed there to prevent stray cattle from destroying her little provision ground, which they had latterly been in the habit of doing, she said. Now the soldiers proceeded for a short distance further, but eventually became suspicious and decided to go back and explore the barricaded path that they had passed. They also confronted the woman, accusing her of lying, and held a gun to her head to force her to confess. She immediately fell on her knees, acknowledged that she belonged to a strong party of well-armed soldiers, and that what she had been doing was conducting them to the rebel camp. She was confident that such a small group of white soldiers would have been easily killed by the rebels before they could retreat. At that precise moment of discovery, the soldiers were within a quarter mile of the rebels. She also admitted that the barricaded entrance led to the place where the 15 white women were being held hostage. Women provided motivation for the soldiers through pre-combat ancestral rituals, strategic maneuvering, supplying water, acting as guides to provision grounds, helping to guard captives, poisoning and acting as lookouts, and even as go-betweens in the final stage of war. And they were among the rebels. There was one woman a very old woman who the soldiers came across on their path to look out for rebels. And she was stirring her pot. And when she saw them coming, she said, "Wow, I'm so glad to see you. I'm cooking some porridge for you." And they said, "You taste it first." And she absolutely refused because she knew it was poison porridge. Now, women, I'm trying to explain the way in which too many of us have ignored women's activism. Women cooked food for the band of rebels who stopped at various properties for revittling purposes. They were one with the cause, as articulated by William Bingham, who said when he was asked, "Why did you rebel?" As if slavery is not enough reason. Anyway, William Bingham, an enslaved man caught and later killed, said, "The Baptists all believe that they are to be freed. They say the Lord and the King have given them free, but the white gentlemen in Jamaica keep it back. They said if they did not fight for freedom, they would never get it. I heard them all say this." Women suffered for their activism, as the punishment list in the UK National Archives indicates, and if you have never been out there, you need to get a reader's card and go there. For example, Eliza Whittingham, Jane Whittingham, Catherine Brown, and Christina James were sentenced to death, and they were hanged. Susanna James was sentenced to 200 lashes. Eliza James, Caroline Smith, and Anne Ramsey got 100 lashes. And Sarah Jackson and Priscilla were transported out of the island for life. They used to send them this way. Now we're sending them back that way. These punishments make for chilling reading, but they are tangible reminders that our ancestors never accepted enslavement uncomplainingly. Monuments like this one that I was so proud to have been behind in terms of lobbying for its construction. This one is in Montego Bay, and it was constructed and unveiled in 2007 during the bicentennial, as we tried to take back the conversation to our space. Symbolize our collective debt to the women whose names you just saw. Governor Belmore, governor of Jamaica at the time during this war, was quite aware that the punishments for many were out of proportion to the so-called crimes. But he defended the horrendous punishments ordered, and this is what he said, or he wrote, "I regret to state that in suppressing this most calamitous rebellion, many slaves have perished in the field, and numbers have been executed after trial. But the audacity of the rebels was so great that striking examples were found indispensably necessary. For mistaken leniency would have only operated as an indirect encouragement to the disaffected to persevere in their lawless designs." Memories of these killings, centuries after the introduction of the slavery system to the Caribbean, caused what Edward Lindenfeld describes as that indigestible fishbone of slavery to continue to stick in our throats. If you are tempted to ask, after being introduced to these women and their activism, where on earth did such women, the alleged subordinate sex, get the nerve to confront systems of domination? The pioneer of Caribbean women's history, Lucille Mathurin Mayer, has an answer for you. It came from that very subordination. The moral force of the powerless confronting the powerful, and from their ability to draw strength from that inheritance of ancestral spirits from that other side of the ocean. It is for these enslaved women that I urge us to be intentional in the support of the cause of reparatory justice and engage in public education so that an informed citizenry can force former colonizers to meet their demands. Reparation rests on firm moral, legal, and political grounds, and the reparation demand is not only for native genocide and the Ma'afa, it is for deceptive indentureship and post-colonial harm. Indeed, the legacies of these atrocities have continued to trap Caribbean people in a cycle of underdevelopment. We need to admit that 180 years or more after emancipation, the people of the Caribbean are still struggling to achieve true political and economic independence and sustainable development, end poverty, and make the region less vulnerable to the ravages of natural and man-made disasters and the impact of climate change and centuries-old environmental degradation. While a multiplicity of strategies has been pursued by the Caribbean in its efforts to overcome socioeconomic, environmental, and political challenges, especially after gaining independence from Western European powers, as those powers left the region and underdeveloped after having exploited our resources with indigenous and forcefully imported labor to ensure its own development, reparation as part of decolonial justice for such underdevelopment has been placed on the table. Reparation also seeks to address continuing harm, seen most vividly in the expressions of racism that still affect so many of us globally. Indeed, despite the independence, emancipation, post-emancipation, civil rights, and more modern struggles against colonialism, anti-black racism, Afrophobia, and other forms of injustice, inequality, and discrimination still attach themselves parasitically to people of African descent all over the world. The circle of racism still threatens to choke us, as the slave collar did our enslaved ancestors. In the post-emancipation Caribbean, a century or more of racial apartheid impeded our actualization of our freedom because the colonizers were never committed to emancipation. Emancipation was the most racist act that I've ever come across, because in order to grant emancipation, compensation had to be paid. In order to calculate compensation, people had to reinforce the idea that black people were property. The financial settlement that accompanied emancipation cemented the British attitude that our ancestors were property, I repeat. Today we may have political independence, but neocolonialism is squeezing our throats so tightly that at times we too can't breathe. African people are still walking in a circle so vividly represented in 2015 Man Booker Prize winner Marlon James's historical novel, The Book of Night Women, in which he says, and I quote, "Every Negro walks in a circle. Take that and make of it what you will. A circle like a sun, a circle like a moon, a circle like bad tidings that seem gone but always comes back." End of quote. While what many have described as the immorality, political irresponsibility, and social injustice of European colonizers, who conceived of, capitalized, managed, and benefited from the Ma'angamizi or African Holocaust for over 400 years, form the philosophical underpinnings of the movement for reparatory justice in the Caribbean. The policy and practice of reparatory justice have been features of European American jurisprudence and history for over 2 centuries. It has always been conceived of as a way to redress wrongs, current or historic, achieve peace and reconciliation, and clear precedent exists. The pioneers of the reparation movement were enslaved Africans all over the Caribbean who knew their illegal entrapment in what Rastafari called Babylon was a violation of their human rights and struggled to end the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and enslavement. In the immediate post-slavery period, the newly emancipated took up the struggle, enforcing ideas of moral economy in their efforts to secure land and decent wages for decent work. Randall Robinson, in his path-breaking book, The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks, published in 2001, tells us that former enslaved people themselves long recognized reparations' potential to right historic wrongs, including in his book this extract from Jordan Anderson's 7th August 1865 letter to his former enslaver. Jordan, once in Big Spring, Tennessee, told his former enslaver that before he would consider returning to his employer as he had written to request, a just financial settlement was necessary. I read a part of his letter. "Sir, if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it would be to my advantage to move back again. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. I have served you faithfully for 32 years, and my wife Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy. $2 a week for Mandy. our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing, 3 doctor's visits for me, and pulling a tooth for Mandy. In all the 20 years, only 1 tooth. Anyway, that's good anyway. Maybe. And the balance will show you what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express. I guess today would say Western Union or some other. But that's a model that formerly enslaved Africans understood this. The 18th and 19th century enslaved-led wars all over the Caribbean, the Morant Bay War in Jamaica, and the 1930s labor protests across the Caribbean, all continued this search for reparatory justice, as the governing classes sought either to maintain slavery or recreate the mentalities and practices of slavery in the post-slavery period, and the masses refused to cooperate in their project, and they're still refusing to cooperate. The post-1930s advocates for freedom, democracy, and reparatory justice were the Rastafari, whose claim was for African redemption and repatriation. They have since been joined by NGOs, academics, civil society, individual politicians on all sides of the Atlantic, and since 2013 by the governments of CARICOM, who have articulated as a negotiating strategy a 10-point action plan. We are all in this together, and we shouldn't hierarchize anyone. We are tighter together. The 10-point action plan, which I know doesn't have universal support, but it's what we have now, begins with a statement of the rationale for the reparation movement in the region, with the CARICOM Reparation Commission asserting that the region's indigenous and African descendant communities, who are the victims of crimes against humanity in the forms of genocide, enslavement, human trafficking, and racial apartheid, have a legal right to reparatory justice, and that those who committed these crimes and those who have been enriched by the proceeds of these crimes have a reparatory justice case to answer. The plan recognizes the special role and status of European governments in this regard, being the legal bodies that instituted the framework for developing and sustaining these crimes, and served as the primary agencies through which slavery-based enrichment took place, and as national custodians of criminally accumulated wealth. So the CARICOM Reparation Commission then sets out the charges against the transgressors and elaborates the strategy for reparatory justice. And as you see there, the 10 points: full formal apology, an indigenous peoples development program, repatriation for those who desire it, the establishment of cultural institutions, and so on. Now, the 9th is technology transfer, which can be located within the right to development framework. The right to development focus is not only captured in the works of scholars who established for us the roots of Caribbean underdevelopment, but also in the artistic expression of our ancestors and our artists. In this verse from Slave Driver, the Honorable Robert Nesta Bob Marley wailed, "Every time I hear the crack of the whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized the very souls. Today they say we are free, only to be chained in poverty. Slave driver, the table is turned." Marley's song not only reflects the memories of ancestral suffering via the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, but the lines, "Today they say we are free, only to be chained in poverty," could very well have been commissioned by the CARICOM Reparation Commission. The program of activities of the Decade for People of African Descent, grounded in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, emphasizes the need for apology, repair, and reconciliation as a way of closing the dark chapters in our history. And if you have never heard about the Decade for People of African Descent, I cannot blame you, because when your government came before the CERD and was asked, what are you planning to do for the Decade for People of African Descent in your country, which has so many people of African descent, the answer was, we have no plan. Finally, the Caribbean Reparatory Justice Program includes debt cancellation and monetary compensation on the basis that the Caribbean governments that emerged from slavery and colonialism have inherited a massive crisis of community poverty and institutional unpreparedness for development. The post-independence demand for development with input from former colonial powers still continues, especially as nationalist leaders anxious to capitalize on the prostate condition of European nations after World War II, in Bruce Seeley's words, never press for compensation. What we are doing now should have been done before. One at the moment well, it couldn't have been at emancipation because the same people were in charge, but certainly at independence, and they never did. On the contrary, the new nations, founded with much hope, face daunting economic challenges. Seeley quotes from Ahmad and Wilkie, who noted, and I quote, "These nations soon began to realize that political freedom could not be construed as an end in itself, and that achieving it did not automatically ensure the social and economic well-being of their people." End of quote. The pressure of development has driven governments to carry the burden of public employment and social policies designed to confront colonial legacies. Reparation advocates use various other arguments for reparation. The injustice is well documented. Plantation slavery provided the scaffold for Britain's industrial advancement. A defendant or perpetrator exists. The victims are identifiable as a group. And those of you who have done your DNA test to anchor yourself firmly within Africa will know this. I've done that. I know that on my mother's side, my enslaved ancestors came from Cameroon. And so I know why I am in this movement. The victims are identifiable as a distinct group. The descendants of victimized groups continue to suffer harm. This remains true today as the institutionalized racism of the colonial era has had a debilitating impact on Africans and people of African descent. Colonialism has economically disenfranchised Africans and people of African descent. There is precedent for the payment of reparation. We all know about what Haiti, some people call it Haiti. The indigenous name is Haiti. We know about that France extracted reparation from Haiti before they would recognize its independence. We know about the Jews. We know about the British planters. And the right to reparation is recognized by international law. Reparation is also supported by Clause 158 of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which recognizes that historical injustices have undeniably contributed to the poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, economic disparities, instability, and insecurity that affect many people in different parts of the world. Royal families throughout Europe developed financial interests in the transatlantic trade, and slavery was profitable for the British economy. One should recall that the English gave royal patronage to the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and African enslavement through the establishment of the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading to Africa, which after 5 years of operation was recapitalized and incorporated into the Royal African Company in 1663. The RAC was chaired by the Duke of York, nephew to the then king, and members of the royal family were prominent investors in it. This is a reason for involving the present monarchy in the reparation claim, as the royal family inherited wealth from that period. In March 2007, British MP Diane Abbott reminded her parliamentary colleagues that 15 Lord Mayors, 25 sheriffs, and 38 aldermen were shareholders in the Royal African Company. It is estimated that in 1776, 40 members of the British Parliament were making their money from investments in the Caribbean. And as we know, compensation was paid to the enslavers and their beneficiaries. As you can see, 46,000 enslavers were compensated more than £20 million at emancipation in 1834, which is estimated to be about, well, some say close to 17 billion pounds today, or 23 billion US dollars. An estimated 27 million more was worked through the apprenticeship system, which was a scam. You're going to tell people who have been working for so long that they must enter a period where they get accustomed to working. 40 to 50% of the 20 million compensation money stayed in the UK and was distributed among 3,000 people. The other 50% was distributed among planters in the colonies, and over 16,000 claims were filed for enslaved people in Jamaica by enslavers in the USA, the UK, and throughout the Atlantic world. And you can see that Britain earned 5 million per year from sugar during the peak of the industry. And over a century, you can see what Britain earned, 2.5 trillion in today's money. Well, I don't know where that slide is. Anyway. Now, oh, I see it. They're flying on the page. Anyway, some of the beneficiaries, I think you know them well anyway. You have heard about the UCL project, so you know some of these. You have seen their photographs all over the place. Now, I included this slide because I thought it was interesting that to see the parish breakdown of the payment to planters from these various parishes. And my brother from St. Mary, you will notice that St. Mary and St. Thomas in the east pay the most, the planters there have got the most money. And surprise, surprise, those are the two poorest parishes in Jamaica right now. Now, despite the rightness of the claim as far as we are concerned, those of us who are in the movement, this is not self-evident to everyone. Even though the right to reparation is recognized in international law. And they give all kinds of reasons. It's too long in the past. There are no victims. They're all dead. Who are we? Standing in front of you. Descendants cannot claim on behalf of their ancestors, and the lawyers tell me there's nothing in international law which prevents the descendants of a crime against humanity from claiming on behalf of their ancestors, and because of the harm they continue to suffer. And of course, this little boy, Lipton Matthews, is carrying that on. The horrors of slavery cannot be used to justify reparation for individuals of African descent residing in the Caribbean. Anyway, one or the other or a combination of these views have been carried by Jamaicans, like this little boy, by former UK prime ministers and functionaries, from former Prime Minister Blair and Cameron to the current UK High Commissioner in Jamaica, Asif Ahmad. And all of their comments are aimed at detaching the modern legacies of chattel enslavement and redirecting it to modern day trafficking and other current human rights issues. And I stand here to say I condemn modern day slavery. I do. But I want us to remember where it's coming from. So this is a position, the articulated UK position, and it's carried on by everyone. Jamaica should move on from the painful legacy of slavery. The British government does not believe that reparations are the answer. And also, Lord Tariq Ahmad, British Minister of State with responsibility for the Caribbean, Commonwealth, and the United Nations. It would be better for Jamaica to look ahead and to maximize its potential through robust trade rather than to peer into history. Who peer more into history than this country? Every corner you go, you see a statue, and I have to stop to see whose statue, who is this? Everywhere you go to the archives, the British Library, all the libraries and the museum. Every city and town. There's only one guy I see who's disagreeing. From all accounts, though, Britain's posture is not new where the Caribbean is concerned, for history has shown that Britain has not always lived up to its responsibilities. For example, Britain was anxious, as Gordon K. Lewis reminds us in The Growth of the Modern West Indies, to use federation as a means of discarding its unwanted responsibilities as a colonial power. In his words, Britain sought withdrawal from the Caribbean area without providing the sort of economic aid to which, on any showing, the colonies were entitled. And I think Sir Ellis Clark says it best. He was the Trinidadian government's UN representative to a subcommittee of the Committee on Colonialism in 1964, and he made this point. An administering power, he urged, is not entitled to extract for centuries all that can be got out of a colony, and when that has been done, to relieve itself of its obligations. Justice requires that reparation be paid. But there is growing support, let's not despair, although the energy unleashed by cartoonists, and even the fact that cartoonists were weighing in, is a new development for Jamaica. I mean, this means the media are paying attention. So this came out after Mr. Cameron. We haven't emerged from slavery, Mr. Cameron. And there's another one which I quite like. There are two. And again, the observer is showing his familiarity with the issues. So, I like this one. This one is kind of funny. Where's my red thing? Anyway, somewhere there, you can see the battery's gone. Anyway, so the Zong, of course, I don't have to remind you about the Zong, the tragedy. It's coming up to another anniversary on the 22nd of December. When the Zong, the captain and his crew threw 132 enslaved Africans who are still alive overboard just for an insurance claim. So, cartoonists are weighing in, and former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson, and we all wish him speedy recovery. You may have heard of his accident. So the energy ebbs and flows despite the fact that we have support, and the movement needs the energy to continue and not ebb and flow. Still, while the former colonial powers have failed to go beyond statements of regret, Princeton Seminary just recently has announced it will pay $27 million in reparation because of its role in slavery, in the slave economy, its investments in banking, and its endowments. Some educational institutions, for example, Georgetown, Glasgow, Brown, Emory, Dalhousie, two previous popes from the Catholic Church, churches, in 2006, the Anglicans, the Jamaica Baptist Union, as you have heard, 2007, the Southern Baptist in 1995, the Jesuit Order in 2017, the Episcopal Church 2006, the Council of World Missions linked to the London Missionary Society, the World Council of Churches, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and the Lutheran World Federation have apologized or taken acts of reparation. Indeed, the former colonial powers have dug in their heels with all that is happening around them, evidenced by the negative responses to CARICOM's letter of demand to 6 colonial powers. Former French President Hollande, for example, in his response to us, stated that history cannot be erased. We do not erase it. It cannot be the subject of transactions at the end of an accounting exercise, which would be at all points impossible to establish. Now, isn't that ironic? Because emancipation was made an accounting exercise when they demanded reparation or paid reparation. While complicit nations stall, anti-black racism is escalating around the world. We have seen it in the treatment of black footballers. We have seen it in the treatment of migrants. We have seen it in racial profiling in various societies and at national borders. Each day we see reports about racial acts on our TV screens, via social media or over the airwaves. We all know about the cases of Stephen Lawrence, Mark Dugan, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, and so many more highlighted here in the UK and the Black Lives Movement in the USA. So why does the movement for repatriate justice still occupy the energies of so many people, especially within the culture of disunity and the presence of vocal anti-reparationists? Can we really destabilize white supremacy, which many see as the obstacle to repatriate justice? Is historian Nell Painter right when she asserts that the racial idea of blackness would likely always be with us, meaning also that white supremacy will always be with us? How do we treat with the idea that, as Ta-Nehisi Coates observes, while the black political tradition is essentially hopeful, history shows us too many examples of heroic people whose struggles were not successful in their own time or at all. On the contrary, to the extent that they were successful, black politics was a necessary precondition, but never enough to foment change. I don't have an answer to that. All I know is that, ahistorical as it may seem to some people, we in the reparation movement have decided not to live in hopelessness. And we wish to use the sections of the program of activities of the International Decade for People of African Descent, which I must say I was proud to pilot through the United Nations while I was chair of the working group, which speak to repatriate justice and reconciliation, to hold states to their obligations. But we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Reparation is a right to redress and repair. It is not an act of begging. And perhaps Jose Marti sums it up best, and I quote from him, not in Spanish though. Rights are to be taken, not requested, seized, not begged for. And as Doudou Dieng, Senegalese Director of Intercultural Projects, said in 2004 at a function to mark the Haitian Bicentenary, the fight for human rights is a fight for remembrance, for any tragedy hidden away can appear again in different forms. Bob Marley and Haile Selassie I put it another way. Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior, and you can read it with me, is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war. Until there are no longer first-class and second-class citizens of any nation, until the color of a person's skin is of no more significance than the color of his or her eyes, until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all, without regard to race. This year war. Well, Haile Selassie has never said this, but anyway, Bob Marley's version. That until that day, the dream of lasting peace, world citizenship, and rule of international morality will remain but a fleeting illusion. That's right. War is not what we need, but what will be the wind at the American and Caribbean window that will open up, create fear among former colonizers to enable the cause of repatriate justice to push through, especially in the face of the tenacity of white supremacy and the tenacity of injustice. So to conclude, I have taken you through a journey of activism and agency of our foremothers. Activism and agency are particularly relevant when speaking about ex-colonial societies where issues of freedom, human rights, restorative justice, citizenship and self-determination had to be settled by rebel men and women before the issues of feminism and women's rights could form a part of the national anti-colonial discourse. Indeed, modern-day women's movements and feminism cannot be understood without excavating and locating the prior waves of activism and theorizing on women's conditions dating back centuries. Long before the year 1851, the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio, where Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" and spoke the truth about women's rights. Long before March 8, 1857 in New York, where garment workers protested inhumane working conditions and later gave inspiration for International Women's Day. And 1977, when UNESCO proclaimed International Women's Day, rebel women in the African Atlantic used a variety of strategies to eradicate or at least destabilize and subvert systems of domination. Anti-slavery, in fact, helped the feminist movement free women seeing in slavery parallels to their own oppressed conditions based on gender, and developed out of this a perception and arguments for female emancipation. As I close, all that is left for us to do right now is to sing praise songs to them and seek redress for what they did for our liberation. The fight against historical injustices is as important, and I hope Mark lining up my stuff, as the fight against current ones, especially as there is a link between the two, the past and the present. So in their honor, I ask you to rise and join me as I call their names and keep them in our hearts and be proud that we, their descendants, are alive today to argue their causes in the interest of justice. And I will start calling their names. Excellent. Please stand with me. Let's call their names and look at the punishment and what they suffered in the cause of freedom. Let's shout their names. Catherine Brown. Catherine, you read. Let's read together. Catherine Clark. Ann James. Christina James. Eliza James. Susan James and Ramsey. Let's look at their names and call their names. Come on, my brothers and sisters. May we, as you sit, never betray their memory, because an injustice without a remedy is abhorrent to the spirit of justice. Raise the volume, my brother. Please sit.